He never came back from the field trip in 1999. Then a suitcase was found buried under the playground. A rusted metal suitcase was hit by the excavator's bucket, its dull thud, a discordant note in the rhythmic symphony of demolition. 25 years after he vanished from the class trip to the old arboretum, buried deep beneath the worn hollows of the elementary school playground, where children had unknowingly played above him, their laughter echoing over a secret kept by the compacted earth. The machine operator, a man calloused by years of unearthing forgotten pipes and stubborn roots, felt the unnatural resistance, saw the disturbed soil cling to something stubbornly angular, something that wasn't stone or concrete, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath, the dust motes hanging suspended in the pale morning light. They had been clearing the ground for a new, state-of-the-art learning pavilion, a symbol of progress, of looking forward, but the past, it seemed, had other plans, clawing its way back into the present with the unyielding grip of rusted hinges and time-fused clasps. The air, thick with the smell of damp earth and shattered asphalt, suddenly felt colder, heavier, as the site foreman approached, his boots crunching on the debris, his face a mask of pragmatic curiosity that would soon crumble. What lay there, cocooned in the dark, indifferent soil, was not just an object, but a vessel, a silent, corroded scream from a time everyone had tried to forget, a time when a small boy named Daniel had walked into the whispering trees of the Blackwood Arboretum with his fourth-grade class, and had simply, impossibly, not walked out. The initial assumption, quickly hardening into a desperate, searching narrative, was that he'd wandered off, a curious child lured by a butterfly or a hidden path, a temporary misadventure that would resolve itself by dusk. But dusk had bled into night, and night into a frantic, sleepless dawn, and then into days, weeks, months, until the seasons themselves had turned. Burying hope under layers of fallen leaves and early snows, the search parties dwindling, their calls growing fainter in the vast, uncaring wilderness, and finally into the resigned silence of years. 25 years, a quarter of a century, a lifetime for some, an eternity for the one who waited, his mother, Sarah, who had never stopped seeing his small hands slip from hers in her dreams, never stopped hearing the echo of his laughter in empty rooms. And now, this metallic intrusion, a dark, rectangular stain against the freshly turned earth, promising answers to questions she had long ago learned to carry like stones in her heart. The foreman knelt, his breath misting, as he carefully brushed away the clinging dirt, revealing the full, grim outline. It was old, undeniably so, the kind of suitcase one might have seen in faded photographs, its surface pitted and scarred by its long, subterranean vigil. There were no markings, no labels, just the mute testimony of its deliberate concealment. He signaled for the work to stop, a sudden, profound stillness falling over the usually cacophonous site, the distant city sounds seeming to recede, focusing all attention on this unexpected, unwelcome artifact. The air grew thick with unspoken dread, the kind that precedes a revelation no one is truly prepared for, the kind that changes everything. You could almost feel the weight of those lost years pressing down, the accumulated grief of a mother, the forgotten fear of a community, all concentrated on that single, unyielding point in the earth. This was not a forgotten piece of playground equipment or a discarded relic of some earlier construction. This felt different, imbued with a somber significance that prickled the skin and tightened the chest, a silent harbinger from a past that refused to remain buried, a past that had finally, inexorably, been unearthed. The sunlight, usually a symbol of clarity and renewal, now seemed to illuminate a stage for a tragedy long deferred, its rays catching the damp sheen of the metal, making it look almost like a weeping wound in the ground. Daniel, he would have been 34 now. Sarah often did the cruel arithmetic, sketching him in her mind, a man with a career perhaps, maybe a family of his own, his face overlaid with the imagined lines of adulthood, yet always, stubbornly, reverting to the gap-toothed 9-year-old, with the bright blue backpack and the untamable tuft of hair at his crown. That morning, the spring of 1999, had been ordinary, painfully so in retrospect. The sky was a hopeful, uncertain blue, the air still holding the crisp memory of a departing winter but hinting at the warmth to come. He'd been excited about the field trip to the Blackwood Arboretum, a sprawling expanse of ancient trees and winding paths on the outskirts of their town, a place known for its quiet beauty and its unsettling, labyrinthine trails. He'd barely touched his toast, his chatter a waterfall of anticipated discoveries. Rare insects, the tallest tree, perhaps even a deer if he was quiet enough. Sarah had knelt to tie his shoelaces, a small, intimate ritual, her fingers brushing his small, sturdy ankles. She remembered the scent of his freshly washed hair, the slightly worried furrow in his brow as he asked, for the third time, if she was sure he had enough snacks. "Yes, my love, enough for a small army," she'd teased, tucking an extra apple into his bag, a small, unconscious act of maternal fortification against an unknown world. He had hugged her tightly at the school gate, a quick, exuberant embrace before he was swallowed by the swirling mass of classmates. Their excited voices, a high-pitched chorus against the rumble of the waiting yellow bus. She'd watched him go, a small figure in a bright red windbreaker, turning once to wave, his smile brilliant, before disappearing inside. That was the last image, seared into her memory, replayed countless times, examined for portents, for any sign, any flicker of the abyss that was about to open. The field trip was meant to be educational, a chance for the children to connect with nature, to learn about the local flora and fauna under the careful supervision of their teachers, Mr. Henderson and Mrs. Albright, and a handful of parent volunteers. The Arboretum, however, possessed a wild, untamed heart beneath its cultivated veneer. Its paths, though marked, could be deceiving, twisting back on themselves, leading into dense thickets where the sunlight struggled to penetrate, where the silence was broken only by the rustle of unseen creatures and the whisper of the wind through ancient branches. It was a place where a child, captivated by the allure of the unknown, could easily stray, could become disoriented, lost in a world that was indifferent to his smallness, his vulnerability. When the call came, late that afternoon, Sarah was at her kitchen table, a half-finished cup of tea growing cold beside her, the house quiet, anticipating his return, the boisterous recounting of his day. Mrs. Albright's voice on the other end of the line was strained, tight, with a forced composure that did little to mask the panic simmering beneath. Daniel was missing. He hadn't been present for the head count before boarding the bus back to school. They thought, they hoped, he was perhaps trailing behind, exploring one last curiosity, but a quick search of the immediate area, the picnic spot, the main visitor center, had yielded nothing. Nothing. The word was a void, a sudden, terrifying emptiness that sucked the air from Sarah's lungs, the mundane reality of her kitchen dissolving into a maelstrom of fear. The world tilted, the ordinary objects around her, the ticking clock on the wall, the cheerful pattern of the tablecloth, seeming to mock her with their continued existence, while her son, her Daniel, was where? He never came back. Not that day, not the next. The vibrant red of his windbreaker became a fleeting, painful splash of color in the searching eyes of police officers and volunteers, a ghost image against the muted greens and browns of the forest. The search began with a frantic, hopeful energy, fueled by adrenaline and the collective determination of a community jolted from its slumber. Police officers, firefighters, and scores of volunteers fanned out across the Arboretum's vast expanse, their voices calling his name Daniel, Daniel, the syllables absorbed by the dense foliage, swallowed by the ancient trees. The air thrummed with the beat of helicopter rotors overhead, their searchlights cutting futile swaths through the darkening canopy as night fell. Sarah, wrapped in a borrowed police blanket, sat on a cold stone bench near the Arboretum's entrance, a command post hastily established, her gaze fixed on the impenetrable wall of trees, a silent, desperate vigil. Her husband, Tom, his face a mask of taut anguish, paced restlessly, conferring in hushed, urgent tones with the lead detective, a man whose initial reassurances, "We find lost kids all the time, Mrs. Miller," began to sound hollow as the hours bled into one another. Each rustle of leaves, each crackle of a radio, sent a jolt of agonizing hope through her, only to be extinguished by the continued absence of news. The forest, which had seemed a place of wonder and learning just hours before, now loomed as a malevolent entity, vast and indifferent, jealously guarding its secrets, perhaps guarding her son. Days turned into a week. The initial surge of volunteers began to wane, replaced by trained search and rescue teams with dogs, their efforts more systematic, more grimly professional. They combed every trail, every ravine, every dense thicket, finding nothing but the occasional discarded wrapper or lost glove from some other forgotten visitor. Daniel's scent, the dog's handlers explained apologetically, had grown cold, dispersed by the wind and rain that had swept through on the third day, washing away footprints, hope. The media descended, their cameras and microphones a constant, intrusive presence, their questions sharp, probing, sometimes tinged with an unstated suspicion that Sarah found unbearable. Was he a wanderer? Were there problems at home? Each question was a fresh stab, a twisting of the knife in a wound that refused to staunch. She answered, her voice a monotone, her eyes hollow, repeating the same sparse details, the same desperate pleas for any information, any sighting. The town held prayer vigils, their flickering candles, small constellations of fragile hope against the encroaching darkness of despair. Flyers bearing Daniel's smiling, gap-toothed face were plastered on every lamppost, every shop window, his image becoming a familiar, heartbreaking fixture in the daily life of the community. Then slowly, inevitably, the search was scaled back. The official narrative solidified: a tragic accident, a boy lost to the unforgiving wilderness, presumed to have succumbed to the elements, his small body perhaps lying in some undiscoverable hollow, hidden from sight. The police files remained open, but active searching ceased. The world, Sarah felt, began to move on, the sharp edges of collective grief softening, the urgency fading. But for her, time had fractured. It was always that spring afternoon in 1999. The playground at Northwood Elementary, Daniel's school, was old even then, its wooden structures weathered, its swings creaking. A year or so after Daniel vanished, long after the yellow ribbons tied to its fences had faded and frayed, the school district, in a move unrelated to the tragedy but keenly felt by Sarah, decided to renovate it. New, brightly colored plastic slides and climbing frames were installed, the old wood carted away. And beneath a section of that playground, where the worn patches of earth testified to generations of children's games, Daniel had apparently lain, undisturbed, unknown. 25 years of children's laughter, of innocent play, echoing above his silent tomb, a macabre, unknowing dance. The not knowing had been a unique form of torture, a constant, gnawing uncertainty that allowed hope to flicker, cruelly, only to be doused by the relentless passage of time. Now, the thud of an excavator's bucket against metal promised a different kind of pain, the brutal finality of truth. The rusted suitcase, once exhumed from its earthy prison, was transported with somber care to the county coroner's office, its journey tracked by a renewed, morbid media frenzy and the haunted gaze of a town forced to confront its unburied ghosts. Sarah waited in a sterile gray room, the silence broken only by the hum of unseen machinery and the frantic beating of her own heart, a relentless drum against the fragile cage of her ribs. Tom was gone now, lost to a different kind of grief, a slow erosion that had eventually worn away the foundations of their shared life, leaving Sarah to face this new chapter of an old nightmare alone. Detective Reynolds, a man much younger than the one who had first offered those hollow reassurances, a man who had probably been a child himself when Daniel disappeared, entered the room, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes holding a depth of sorrow that spoke volumes before he uttered a word. He sat opposite her, a manila folder placed gently on the table between them, a slender barrier against the immensity of what it contained. He began to speak, his voice low, measured, choosing his words with a precision that felt both kind and terrifying. The suitcase, he explained, had been remarkably well preserved internally, the tightly packed earth around it forming a near anaerobic seal against the worst of the decay. Inside, nestled amongst the damp, musty fabric, they had found items that required her identification, if she was able. Her breath hitched. This was it. The precipice she had unknowingly walked towards for a quarter of a century. He slid a photograph across the table. It was a child's windbreaker, once bright red, now stained and faded, the fabric darkened with the patina of time and earth. But the distinctive stitching on the pocket, a small, clumsily embroidered rocket ship she had sewn on herself after Daniel had developed a fleeting obsession with astronauts, was unmistakable. A gasp tore from her throat, a ragged, painful sound. It was his, Daniel's, jacket, the one he had worn that day, the one that had been her last vivid image of him, waving from the bus. Tears, hot and sudden, blurred her vision, each one a testament to 25 years of unshed grief, of forced composure. Then came the bones. Detective Reynolds didn't show her photographs of those, for which she was profoundly, silently grateful. He simply stated, his voice softening further, that the skeletal remains found within the suitcase were consistent with those of a child of Daniel's age and approximate size at the time of his disappearance. Dental records, if they could be obtained from his childhood dentist, if those records even still existed, would be needed for definitive confirmation. But the preliminary assessment, the context, the jacket, there was little doubt. Daniel, her Daniel, not lost in the vast wilderness, succumbing to the cold or a fall, but here, placed, buried, in a suitcase. The word itself was an obscenity, a grotesque perversion of its intended purpose: travel, adventure, new beginnings. For Daniel, it had been an end, a cramped, dark, final confinement. A wave of nausea washed over Sarah, the sterile room seeming to tilt, the fluorescent lights too bright, too harsh. He had been so close all along. While she had scanned the distant tree lines, while she had imagined him wandering further and further away, he had been here, under the ground, just miles from their home, beneath the very school that should have been his sanctuary. The irony was a cruel, physical blow. The weight of those thousands of days, each one lived with the ache of his absence, pressed down on her, threatening to crush her. And then the detective mentioned the other item, the one that would shatter the fragile semblance of understanding she was beginning to construct, the one that would twist this tragic resolution into something infinitely more sinister. A journal, a small, spiral-bound notebook, the kind children use for doodles and secrets, its pages warped and stained, but many still legible. The journal lay on the evidence table, a fragile, water-stained relic, its cover, once perhaps a cheerful primary color, now a mottled, indeterminate gray-brown. Sarah reached for it with a trembling hand, the paper cool and slightly yielding beneath her fingertips, a physical link to her son's last days, his last thoughts. Detective Reynolds had explained that forensic analysts were still carefully working to preserve and decipher the more damaged pages, but much of the initial portion was surprisingly clear. The childish pencil scrawl a ghostly echo from the past. She opened it, her heart pounding, a strange mix of dread and desperate longing churning within her. The first few pages were exactly what she might have expected, filled with the mundane and magical observations of a 9-year-old boy on an adventure. Drawings of trees with knobbly faces, a lopsided sketch of a squirrel, notes about the different types of leaves Mr. Henderson had shown them. Saw a blue bird today, one entry read, dated the morning of the field trip. Mr. H says it is a Steller's jay. It was very loud. I wish I could fly. A pang of unbearable tenderness shot through Sarah. His voice, so clear in those simple words, the innocent wonder, the fleeting desires of a child. She could almost see him, sitting on a log, tongue poked out in concentration as he wrote, the sounds of the forest around him, the laughter of his classmates in the distance. She turned the page, her breath catching in her throat. The next entry was dated later that same day, but the handwriting was different, shakier, the pencil strokes heavier, more urgent. Lost, it began. The single words stark and terrifying. Can't find Mr. H or class. Trees all look same. Called out. No one came. The neat, ordered world of the earlier pages dissolved into a growing sense of unease. Sarah read on, her own fear mirroring the palpable anxiety seeping from the aged paper. Daniel described wandering, shouting until his throat was sore, the sun beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple that brought no comfort, only a deeper sense of isolation. Getting dark. Cold, he wrote. I want Mom. Each word was a tiny hammer blow against Sarah's carefully constructed defenses. She could feel his fear, his small hand reaching out from the page, grasping for hers across the chasm of years. The journal entries continued, a fragmented, desperate chronicle of his ordeal. He found a small, dilapidated shed, possibly an old groundskeeper's hut, deep within the arboretum, and huddled there for warmth as night fell, the sounds of the forest pressing in, strange and menacing. He wrote of hunger, of thirst, of the terror of being alone in the vast, indifferent darkness. You could almost smell the damp earth, the decaying leaves, feel the oppressive silence of his solitude, a silence broken only by the frantic thumping of his own small heart. These entries, detailing his initial hours, perhaps the first day or two after he officially vanished, painted a heartbreaking picture of a lost child's struggle for survival, his resilience battling against mounting despair. They aligned, tragically, with the narrative the police had constructed. A boy who wandered too far, got lost, and eventually succumbed to the elements. It was a horrific thought, but one that had, over the years, acquired a certain grim familiarity, a story Sarah had been forced to tell herself to make sense of the void. But the journal did not end there. There were more pages, more entries, and as Sarah continued to read, her blood ran cold, the initial sorrow hardening into a sickening dread. The narrative was about to take a darker, more horrifying turn, one that would unravel everything she thought she understood about her son's disappearance, one that hinted at a human malevolence far more terrifying than the indifference of nature. The shift in the journal was subtle at first, a change in the certainty of his isolation. After a few entries detailing his solitary fear and hunger in the small, dilapidated shed, a new element appeared. Someone came, he wrote, the letters small, almost tentative, as if he himself couldn't quite believe it. A man. He said he would help. Sarah's heart leaped with a sudden, desperate hope, immediately followed by a chilling premonition. Who was this man? A park ranger? Another searcher? Daniel's description was sparse, childishly vague. He's quiet. Gave me water and a sandwich. It tasted old. The detail about the sandwich, so specific, so innocent, sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. It was the kind of observation a child would make, unburdened by adult suspicion, yet it resonated with a peculiar wrongness. The entries that followed became more confusing, more fragmented, the handwriting growing more erratic, the pencil lines sometimes faint, sometimes gouged into the paper. He wasn't in the shed anymore. He was somewhere else. Somewhere dark. It's not outside, he wrote. No trees, just dark and quiet, too quiet. He mentioned being moved, though he didn't seem to understand how or when. There were gaps in his awareness, periods he couldn't account for. He wrote about being scared, about wanting to go home, about asking the quiet man when he could see his mom. The man, Daniel wrote, just looked at him with sad eyes and said, "Soon." The word soon repeated, a hollow promise. The journal detailed small, almost mundane observations from his confinement. The texture of a rough blanket, the taste of stale crackers, the sound of dripping water somewhere nearby. He tried to keep track of days by making marks on the wall of his enclosure, but he wasn't sure he was getting it right. I think it is many days now. One entry read, "The man brings food. Sometimes he talks. Says, 'I am safe here, but I don't feel safe.'" Sarah felt a suffocating tightness in her chest. This wasn't a child lost in the woods. This was a child held captive. Her Daniel, her brave little boy, enduring an unimaginable terror, not at the mercy of the elements, but at the mercy of another human being. The realization was a physical blow, stealing her breath, making the room spin. The carefully constructed narrative of accidental tragedy shattered into a million jagged pieces, replaced by a far more monstrous truth. He hadn't just wandered off and succumbed. He had been taken. He had been held. And then he had been put in a suitcase. The sequence of events was unthinkable, a descent into a kind of darkness Sarah had never allowed herself to contemplate. The journal became a testament to his fading hope, his growing understanding that the helper was not a savior. He wrote about drawing pictures on the walls with a small stone to pass the time, about singing songs to himself in a whisper, about missing his dog, Buddy, and the way sunlight felt on his face. These small acts of defiance, of clinging to normalcy in an abnormal world, were almost unbearable for Sarah to read. And then, towards the very end of the legible entries, came the name. It was written almost as an afterthought, tucked at the bottom of a page filled with anxious scribbles and repeated pleas to go home. "Mr. Peterson was here today." Daniel had written, "He brought me a new drawing book. He said I should not tell anyone he visits. He said it's our secret. Mr. Peterson, Arthur Peterson." The quiet, unassuming school librarian's assistant. A man who had worked at Northwood Elementary for over 30 years, a fixture in the background, known for his gentle demeanor, his love of books, his almost invisible presence. He sometimes volunteered to help supervise lunch or playground duty. He had even been part of the initial frantic search at the Arboretum, his face etched with what everyone had assumed was concern, his quiet words of sympathy offered to Sarah in the days that followed. The name hung in the air, a venomous accusation. Mr. Peterson. It couldn't be. And yet, there it was, in her son's own hand, a childish scrawl condemning a man no one, absolutely no one, had ever suspected. The name echoed in the sterile silence of the room. Mr. Peterson, Arthur Peterson. Sarah stared at the page, the neatly formed letters of his name, a stark contrast to Daniel's increasingly frantic script. It felt like a betrayal of reality itself. Peterson, the mild-mannered librarian's assistant, a man whose defining characteristic was his unobtrusiveness, his almost spectral ability to blend into the background of school life. He was the one who mended torn book pages with meticulous care, who helped children find just the right story, his voice always soft, his smile gentle, if a little distant. He had offered Sarah a cup of lukewarm tea in the chaotic school office on that first terrible afternoon, his eyes filled with what she had then interpreted as shared distress. Had that been a performance? A monstrous, calculated act of deception. The thought was sickening, a corrosive acid eating away at the foundations of her memory. Detective Reynolds, observing her reaction, nodded slowly, his expression grim. They had already run a preliminary check on Arthur Peterson. He was still alive, aged now, well into his 70s, retired for over a decade, living in a small, meticulously kept bungalow on the other side of town. He had no criminal record, not even a parking ticket. He was, by all accounts, a model citizen, a quiet retiree who tended his roses and borrowed copious amounts of books from the public library. A wolf in the most unassuming sheep's clothing imaginable. The journal, however, did not end with just the name. As Sarah's trembling fingers turned the last few fragile pages, her eyes scanned lines that sent a fresh wave of horror through her, a horror that expanded beyond her own personal tragedy, hinting at something far more widespread, far more diabolical. Daniel had written in a passage that was smudged and difficult to decipher, as if penned in near darkness or by a hand trembling with fear or weakness. He said, "I was not the only one." He said there were other suitcases, for other children who got lost. He said it was to keep them safe. But it's not safe here. It's cold. Other suitcases. The words leaped off the page, searing themselves into Sarah's mind. Not just Daniel. Other children. The implication was staggering, almost too vast to comprehend. Had Peterson been doing this for years? Were there other small bodies? Other stolen lives? Buried in other forgotten places? Their stories silenced? Their families left to wonder, to grieve without answers, just as she had. The playground under which Daniel was found, had Peterson, with his access to the school, his knowledge of its grounds, chosen that spot deliberately? Had he watched, year after year, as children played above his terrible secret, perhaps deriving some twisted satisfaction from the proximity, the audacity of it? The thought of his quiet, unassuming presence moving through the school halls, his gentle smile masking such profound darkness, was almost unbearable. Detective Reynolds confirmed her unspoken fear. The reference to other suitcases was now the primary focus of their reactivated investigation. It transformed Daniel's case from a singular, albeit horrific, tragedy into potentially the work of a serial predator, one who had operated undetected for an unknown number of years, hiding in plain sight. The police were already cross-referencing missing children cases from the region, going back decades, looking for any possible connection to Peterson, to Northwood Elementary, to the Arboretum, any pattern that might have been missed, any clue overlooked in the pre-digital age of investigation. The scale of it was dizzying, a tapestry of potential sorrow that stretched far beyond her own. Daniel's journal, his small, brave voice from the grave, had not only solved the mystery of his own fate, but had potentially unearthed a darkness that had festered, hidden for far too long. The room felt cold, despite the hum of the heating system. Sarah closed the journal gently, her fingers lingering on its worn cover. Her son had endured unimaginable terror, but even in his fear, he had left a trail, a testament, a warning. He had named his captor, and he had hinted at a wider web of evil. He had given them a starting point. The quiet man, Mr. Peterson, was about to have his meticulously constructed world of benign invisibility shattered. The revelation of Arthur Peterson's name and the horrifying implication of other victims sent shockwaves through the police department and, soon, through the shell-shocked community. The investigation, dormant for a quarter of a century, roared back to life with a grim, urgent intensity. Detective Reynolds, now leading a task force, coordinated efforts that spanned multiple agencies. Old files were exhumed, dusted off, their contents pored over with fresh, horrified eyes. Missing persons reports from the 70s, 80s, and 90s were flagged, particularly those involving children in the vicinity of Northwood Elementary or other locations Peterson might have frequented. His employment history was scrutinized, his movements tracked back through decades of quiet, unassuming existence. Had he worked at other schools, volunteered at youth centers, lived in other towns? Every detail of his seemingly unremarkable life was now suspect, potentially concealing a landscape of unimaginable cruelty. Officers were dispatched to Arthur Peterson's bungalow, a quaint, ivy-covered cottage that now seemed to radiate a palpable chill. They found him in his garden, pruning roses with a pair of antique shears, his movements slow and deliberate, his face lined and softened by age, showing only mild surprise at their arrival. He was frail, slightly stooped, his eyes, magnified by thick-lensed glasses, watery and vague. When questioned about Daniel Miller, his brow furrowed in apparent confusion. Daniel Miller? The name seemed to stir a faint, distant memory. Oh, yes, the little boy who got lost in the Arboretum. Such a tragedy. He remembered the sadness at the school, the worried faces of the teachers. He offered them tea. His composure was unnerving, his denial placid, almost gentle. There was no flicker of fear, no telltale sign of guilt in his faded blue eyes. Confronted with the journal, with Daniel's own words naming him, he simply shook his head, a slow, sorrowful gesture. A child's imagination, he suggested softly. Children get confused, especially when they are frightened, lost. He maintained his innocence with a quiet dignity that was, in itself, profoundly disturbing. Was it the unshakable confidence of a master manipulator honed over decades of deception? Or the failing memory of an old man, genuinely oblivious? Or perhaps having compartmentalized his own monstrous acts so completely that they no longer existed in his conscious mind? The search of his house began. It was a place frozen in time, meticulously clean, filled with books, classical music records, and dusty antiques. There were no obvious signs of a struggle, no hidden rooms, no overtly incriminating evidence at first glance. But the forensic teams were thorough, patient, peeling back the layers of his life with painstaking care. They examined his old school records, his personal correspondence, his photograph albums, looking for any slip, any anomaly. The grounds of his bungalow were also searched, the neatly tended flower beds, and the small, overgrown patch of woods at the back of his property subjected to the methodical probing of ground-penetrating radar. The phrase, "other suitcases," hung heavy in the air, a ghostly instruction guiding their hands. For Sarah, the news of Peterson's placid denial was another twist of the knife. She had imagined, perhaps naively, a confession, a breakdown, some acknowledgement of the immense suffering he had caused. Instead, there was only this quiet, almost gentle obfuscation. It felt like Daniel was being dismissed all over again, his terror, his words, negated by the calm facade of this elderly man. She clung to the journal, rereading Daniel's entries, his voice a fragile counterpoint to Peterson's steadfast denials. The police, meanwhile, began to find small, unsettling things in Peterson's home. Old-school yearbooks with certain children's faces faintly circled. A collection of small, inexpensive toys, a yo-yo, a set of marbles, a plastic figurine, tucked away in a dusty box in the attic, items that seemed out of place in the home of a solitary, childless man. And then, in a locked filing cabinet in his study, they found a series of hand-drawn maps, crudely sketched but detailed, of various local parks, wooded areas, and, chillingly, the grounds of several other elementary schools in the wider district where Peterson had, at various times, done temporary library work or volunteered decades ago. On these maps, certain spots were marked with small, neat X's. Were these the locations of the other suitcases? The thought sent a collective shudder through the investigative team. The quiet librarian's assistant, the gentle old man tending his roses, was beginning to look like a meticulous predator who had charted his hunting grounds with cold, calculating precision. The search had just begun, but the tendrils of Arthur Peterson's secret life were slowly, horrifyingly, coming to light, promising more grief, more unanswered questions, even as they offered a terrible kind of clarity. The investigation into Arthur Peterson became a grim excavation of a past no one knew existed. Each X on his hand-drawn maps was a potential gravesite, a point of unspeakable sorrow. Teams were dispatched to these locations, quiet suburban parks, overgrown lots behind disused municipal buildings, the forgotten corners of schoolyards that had long since been redeveloped. The work was slow, arduous, conducted with a heavy sense of dread. The media, initially buzzing with the discovery of Daniel's suitcase, now followed the unfolding story with a kind of horrified awe. The narrative expanding from a single tragedy to the horrifying possibility of a hidden epidemic of loss, orchestrated by a man who had lived among them unnoticed for decades. Sarah watched the news reports, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. Each new search site was a fresh torment, imagining other mothers, other families, who might soon face the same devastating confirmation she had endured. Daniel's story, his suffering, was no longer just hers. It was becoming a shared nightmare, a testament to a betrayal that cut across an entire community, perhaps an entire generation. The first few X's yielded nothing but compacted earth, old construction debris, the detritus of forgotten years. Hope, if such a word could be used in this context, began to mingle with a weary frustration among the investigators. Was Peterson toying with them, even now? Were the maps a red herring, a final, cruel game from a failing mind? Or had time, development, and the shifting landscape obliterated any trace? Then, at a site marked on one of Peterson's maps, an overgrown patch of land behind what was once a small, rural library branch, where he had worked briefly in the early 1980s, a sonar anomaly was detected. Another metallic signature. The excavation was careful, painstaking, the air thick with unspoken tension. And there it was, another suitcase. Smaller than Daniel's, its metal even more corroded, almost fused shut by time and moisture. Inside, the remains were heartbreakingly small, wrapped in a tattered, faded blanket. Beside them, a single, tarnished silver locket, heart-shaped. The locket belonged to a little girl named Emily Carter, who had vanished from a park near that library branch in 1982. She was 6 years old. Her case, like Daniel's, had gone cold, attributed to a possible abduction by a stranger, a transient, a phantom who was never caught. Now, the phantom had a name, Arthur Peterson. The discovery of Emily's remains sent a fresh wave of revulsion and grief through the community. 2 children, 2 suitcases, 2 lives stolen and hidden by the man who tended roses and spoke in gentle tones. The X's on Peterson's maps now took on an even more sinister weight. How many more were there? The search intensified, a grim pilgrimage from one marked spot to another. Some yielded nothing. Others, heartbreakingly, confirmed the worst. A 3rd suitcase was found near an abandoned railway line, containing the remains of a boy who had disappeared in 1977. A 4th, partially unearthed by erosion on a steep, wooded embankment, held the fragile bones of another child, unidentified for now, another ghost-given form. With each discovery, the portrait of Arthur Peterson solidified, a meticulous, patient predator who had used his innocuous persona as a shield, preying on the vulnerable, burying his secrets with chilling precision. He remained in custody, his health reportedly declining, still offering no confession, no explanation, just that same unnerving, placid denial. Perhaps his mind, like the suitcases, was a locked container, its contents too horrific to face, even for him. For Sarah, each new revelation was a complex mix of emotions. There was a strange, sorrowful solidarity with the families of these other children, a shared understanding of the unique agony of their loss, and the bittersweet pain of finally knowing. But there was also a profound, overwhelming sadness for the sheer scale of his evil, for the innocence he had destroyed, for the lives he had so casually erased. Daniel's journal, his brave, terrified words, had become a key, unlocking a crypt of unimaginable sorrow, but also, perhaps, a crypt that needed to be opened, its horrors exposed to the light. However painful, the investigation was far from over. More X's remained to be checked, more questions to be answered. But the truth, in all its monstrous scope, was finally, undeniably, emerging from the earth. The weight of Daniel's journal, now carefully preserved in an evidence bag but forever imprinted on Sarah's soul, was immense. It was the voice of her child, reaching across a quarter-century of silence, not only to tell his own story, but to give voice to others who could no longer speak. The playground at Northwood Elementary was eventually rebuilt, the new learning pavilion gleaming under the sun. But for Sarah, the ground beneath would always be sacred, haunted. She would never hear the laughter of children there without thinking of Daniel, of the secrets the earth had kept, of the innocence lost, and the terrible truths unearthed. Arthur Peterson's trial, if he lived long enough to face one, promised to be a drawn-out, agonizing affair. His lawyers were already hinting at defenses of diminished capacity, of dementia, of a frail old man incapable of comprehending the charges against him. Justice, Sarah realized, might be incomplete, a legal process unable to fully encompass the enormity of his crimes or the depth of the suffering he had inflicted. But there was a different kind of justice in the truth itself, in the names being spoken again, in the stories being pieced together, however fragmented, however painful. The other suitcases, those already found, and those perhaps still waiting to be discovered, represented a constellation of extinguished stars, young lives cut short by a darkness that had masqueraded as gentle kindness. For the families of Emily Carter and the other children whose remains were slowly being identified, the discoveries brought a devastating closure, an end to the torment of not knowing, replaced by the stark reality of murder. There were no bittersweet reunions, only the cold comfort of remains, of a final resting place, of a name for the monster who had haunted their lives. Sarah found herself attending support meetings, initially for herself, then as other families were drawn into this horrifying circle for them. There was a shared language of grief, of outrage, of the struggle to reconcile the image of the beloved child with the brutal manner of their end. They were a reluctant community, bound by the unthinkable actions of one man. In Daniel's journal, he had written about wanting to fly. He had drawn pictures of rocket ships and birds. He had dreamed of escape, and in a way, Sarah thought, his words had finally allowed him and others to take flight from the darkness that had held them captive for so long. His small, brave voice had broken the silence, had exposed the predator, had brought a measure of terrible, necessary truth to the world. The emotional catharsis was not a sudden, healing flood, but a slow, painful lancing of a wound that had festered for decades. There was resilience, yes, born of enduring the unimaginable, of facing the truth head-on. But the scars remained, deep and permanent, a testament to the love that had been stolen, the futures that had been erased. Sometimes Sarah would visit the arboretum, not the dark, overgrown paths where Daniel had first been lost, but the sunnier, more open glades. She would sit on a bench and look at the trees, listening to the wind, and she would think of Daniel, not as a victim in a suitcase, but as the bright, laughing boy who had been so excited about seeing a bluebird. The horror was still there, a shadow that would never fully recede, but alongside it now was a sense of peace, a quiet understanding that his story, though tragic, had a meaning beyond its sorrow. It was a warning, a testament, a small, persistent light that had finally, after 25 long years, guided others out of the dark. The search for other suitcases continued, a grim task that would likely span years, but for Daniel at least, there was a form of rest. His name was cleared of any implication that he had simply wandered off and been forgotten by fate. He had been fought for, his memory cherished, and his final words had, in the end, spoken with a power that even his murderer could not silence. The earth beneath the playground held no more secrets of his, only the lingering echo of a truth that had, at last, been brought into the unforgiving light.